Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true Appalachian Trail horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about America's oldest and most isolated mountain wilderness. These are not campfire tales or urban legends, but documented accounts from hikers who encountered the unexplainable on one of the most challenging and remote trails in the world. Each story has been meticulously researched through first-hand testimonies, cross-referenced with official reports, and verified through trail registers and Park Service records. From unexplained disappearances and encounters with forces beyond comprehension to psychological terror that defies rational explanation. These accounts represent the darkest experiences shared by those who walked the 2,190-mile corridor through ancient forests, where civilization barely reaches. The Appalachian Trail holds mysteries that most hikers will never speak about. And after tonight, you will understand why. If you are drawn to genuine horror content rooted in real experiences that will challenge your sense of safety in the wilderness, subscribe to Buried Files and enable the notification bell so you never miss our deep investigations into cases that authorities cannot explain. After you hear these 7 chilling testimonies, we encourage you to share your own unexplained wilderness encounters in the comments below, as your story might be featured in our next episode. Now settle in, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself as we descend into the terrifying reality of what truly lurks along the Appalachian Trail. Walter Jennings was not the kind of man who did things on a whim. At 42 years old, he had spent the better part of 2 decades working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in suburban Pennsylvania, where predictability and order were not just preferred, but required. His life had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of spreadsheets, tax codes, and weekend hikes on well-marked trails near his home. He was methodical, cautious, and always prepared. So when he announced to his wife Margaret that he was going to attempt his first solo section hike on the Appalachian Trail, she was surprised but not concerned. Walter had been planning it for months, researching every mile of the Georgia section he intended to cover, studying trail maps until he could recite shelter names and water sources from memory. It was late September when Walter drove down to Amicalola Falls State Park in northern Georgia, where the approach trail to the Appalachian Trail begins. The air had started to cool, and the forests were beginning their slow transformation into autumn colors. He checked in at the visitor center, signed the trail register, and spent nearly 20 minutes speaking with a ranger about current trail conditions. The ranger noted that Walter seemed well prepared, carrying a satellite phone, a GPS device, plenty of food, and appropriate gear for the season. He had planned a modest 5-day route that would take him through some of the more scenic sections of the southern Appalachians, ending at Neal's Gap, where Margaret would pick him up. The first 2 days went exactly as Walter had planned. He hiked at a steady pace, stopping frequently to take photographs and make detailed entries in his trail journal. He noted the temperature, the wildlife he encountered, and his own physical condition. On the first night, he stayed at Hawk Mountain Shelter, where he met 2 northbound through hikers who were finishing their journey. They shared stories over freeze-dried meals, and Walter felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had been looking for. A chance to test himself, to experience solitude, and to prove that he was still capable of adventure. On the second night, he camped at Gooch Mountain Shelter, and his journal entry from that evening was cheerful and optimistic. He wrote about the stunning views from the ridgeline, the kindness of fellow hikers, and his anticipation for the days ahead. But there was one line at the end of that entry that would later become significant. He wrote that he had felt briefly disoriented on the trail that afternoon, as though he had passed the same distinctive boulder twice. Even though his map clearly showed he was making forward progress, He dismissed it as fatigue and noted that he would get a good night of sleep. The third day was when everything changed. Walter was scheduled to reach Blood Mountain Shelter by late afternoon, where he planned to stay for the night. Margaret expected him to check in via satellite phone by 6 in the evening, as he had done the previous 2 nights. When 6 o'clock came and went without a call, she was not immediately worried. Service could be unpredictable, and Walter might have simply decided to push on to the next shelter. But when 7 o'clock passed, then 8, and still no word, Margaret began to feel the first stirrings of real concern. By 9 o'clock, she was on the phone with the Park Service, reporting that her husband had failed to check in. A search and rescue operation was launched the following morning. A team of rangers and volunteers hiked to Blood Mountain Shelter, expecting to find Walter either there or somewhere along the approach trail. What they found instead was deeply unsettling. Walter's backpack was at the shelter, neatly arranged on one of the wooden sleeping platforms. His sleeping bag was rolled and tied with precision. His food bag hung properly from the bear cables. His hiking boots were placed side by side near the pack, as though he had removed them before going to sleep. But Walter himself was nowhere to be found. The search team immediately began canvassing the area, calling his name, checking nearby water sources, and examining the trail in both directions. It was one of the rangers who found Walter's journal, still tucked into a side pocket of his pack. The final entry was dated the morning of the 3rd day, and it was unlike any of his previous entries. The handwriting was shaky, less controlled. He wrote that he had woken before dawn feeling strange, as though he had not slept at all, despite having no memory of lying awake. He described a persistent sensation of being watched, a feeling that had started the moment he opened his eyes and had not diminished even as the sun rose. He wrote that he could not shake the impression that something in the forest was waiting for him, and that he felt compelled to go find it. The rangers found this entry disturbing, but what came next was even more troubling. When they examined Walter's GPS device, which was still in his pack and fully charged, they discovered that the tracking data told an impossible story. According to the device, Walter had spent more than 6 hours the previous afternoon walking in a tight circular pattern, covering the same 200-yard radius again and again. The path formed an almost perfect spiral on the digital map, tightening with each loop until the signal abruptly stopped in the exact center. The timestamp showed that the device had lost signal at 3:27 in the afternoon, right around the time Walter should have been arriving at the shelter. Search dogs were brought in, but their behavior was strange. The animals picked up Walter's scent easily enough and followed it from the shelter down a narrow side trail that led toward a series of rocky outcroppings. But after less than a quarter mile, the dogs stopped abruptly. They began to whine and pull backward, refusing to go any further, despite the urgings of their handlers. One of the dogs became so agitated that it had to be removed from the search entirely. The handlers, all experienced professionals, admitted they had never seen anything quite like it. By the afternoon of the 2nd day of searching, the operation had expanded significantly. A helicopter was brought in to conduct aerial surveys of the surrounding area, and additional volunteers were called in to cover more ground. It was the helicopter crew that finally spotted Walter. He was nearly 4 miles from Blood Mountain Shelter, far off any established trail, walking through dense forest in a perfectly straight line. The crew radioed his position to the ground team, who immediately began moving to intercept him. The ground team struggled through thick undergrowth and steep terrain, racing to reach Walter before he disappeared again. When they finally caught sight of him, he was standing at the edge of a deep ravine, motionless, staring down into the shadowed depths below. One of the rangers called out his name, but Walter did not respond immediately. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, And then slowly, deliberately, he turned to face them. His expression was blank, his eyes unfocused. When he spoke, his voice was flat and distant. He said, "They are waiting below." And before anyone could react, he took a single step backward and fell off the edge. The fall should have killed him. The ravine dropped nearly 40 feet to a rocky streambed below. But somehow, impossibly, Walter survived. He landed in a way that broke both legs, fractured his pelvis, and caused severe internal injuries. But he remained conscious. The rescue team rappelled down to reach him, and he was airlifted by helicopter to a trauma center in Atlanta. During the flight, he kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "They called me. I had to go to them." Walter spent weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries. Margaret stayed by his side, but she noticed that her husband was not the same man who had left for that hike. He was distant, distracted, and refused to speak about what had happened on the trail. When doctors and authorities questioned him, he claimed to have no memory of the events following his departure from Blood Mountain Shelter. He could not explain why he had left his gear behind, why he had walked in circles, or why he had gone off trail. He had no memory of the helicopter, no memory of standing at the ravine, and no memory of the fall. But Margaret knew he was lying. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he flinched when she mentioned the Appalachian Trail, in the way he stared out the hospital window as though searching for something in the distance. One night, when she pressed him, he finally spoke. He told her that he remembered everything. He remembered waking at the shelter and feeling the pull, an overwhelming compulsion to go into the forest. He remembered walking, not in circles as the GPS suggested, but in a straight line toward something he could not see but could feel with absolute certainty. He remembered voices, not heard with his ears but felt in his chest, calling him deeper and deeper. And he remembered reaching the ravine and looking down to see figures standing in the shadows below, figures that were waiting for him, figures that he knew he was meant to join. Margaret begged him to speak to a therapist, to get help processing the trauma. Walter agreed to attend 3 sessions, but he refused to continue after that. He would not explain why. When Margaret found the number for the therapist and called to ask what had happened, the woman would only say that Walter had described experiences that she was not equipped to address, and that she had referred him to a colleague who specialized in more unusual cases. Walter never followed up with that referral. Authorities searched the ravine extensively, looking for any clues that might explain Walter's behavior. They found nothing unusual. No signs of other people, no structures, no evidence of drug use or environmental factors that might have caused hallucinations. The GPS data remained unexplained, a digital record of something that should not have been possible. Walter eventually recovered enough to return home, though he walked with a permanent limp and would never regain full mobility. He returned to his job, but his co-workers noticed the change. He was quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped hiking entirely, even refusing to walk on the trails near his home. Margaret tried to be supportive, but the distance between them grew. Walter spent hours staring out the windows, and she often woke in the night to find him standing in the backyard, looking toward the mountains in the distance. 3 years after the incident, Margaret filed for divorce. She told her sister that she could not live with a man who was only half present, a man whose mind was still somewhere out in those woods. Walter did not contest the divorce. He moved into a small apartment and continued working, but he isolated himself almost completely. The few people who remained in contact with him said that he seemed to be waiting for something, though he would never say what. To this day, Walter Jennings has never given a full account of what happened to him on the Appalachian Trail. The official report lists the incident as a case of acute psychological distress brought on by solo hiking and possible dehydration. But those who were involved in the search know that explanation does not fit the facts. The spiral pattern on the GPS, the reaction of the search dogs, and Walter's own words all point to something far stranger. And somewhere in northern Georgia, on a stretch of trail that sees thousands of hikers every year, there is a place where the forest grows quiet, where compasses spin without reason, and where those who listen too carefully might hear something calling from the trees. Clarence Mitchell had earned his trail name honestly. At 55 years old, the retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades following orders and giving them. On the Appalachian Trail, where he had started his northbound through hike in early March, other hikers had quickly dubbed him Sarge, and the name stuck. Clarence did not mind. He had spent his entire adult life in the Corps, and even though he had retired 2 years earlier, the military mindset was not something he could simply switch off. He woke at dawn, maintained his gear with meticulous care, and hiked with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who understood that consistency mattered more than speed. By late April, Clarence had made it to Virginia, the longest state on the trail and one that tested the patience of even the most determined hikers. The terrain was challenging, but not impossible, and the weather had been cooperating. Spring was arriving in earnest, with wildflowers beginning to bloom and the trees filling in with new leaves. Clarence had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, and for the first time since his retirement, he felt like he had found a sense of purpose again. It was on a warm Thursday afternoon that Clarence stopped at a small stream crossing to filter water and found himself joined by a younger hiker who introduced himself as Eugene, though everyone on the trail called him Tadpole. Eugene was 26, thin and energetic, with the kind of enthusiasm that marked someone still early in their through hike. He had started at Springer Mountain 3 weeks after Clarence and had been pushing longer days to catch up with a group of friends somewhere ahead. The 2 men struck up an easy conversation while they filled their water bottles, discussing trail conditions, upcoming shelter locations, and the usual complaints about Virginia's endless miles. When Eugene mentioned that he was planning to stop at the partnership shelter about 6 miles ahead, Clarence nodded. He had been planning the same thing. The shelter was located near a Forest Service road and was known for being well maintained, with a reliable water source and plenty of space. It seemed like an ideal place to end the day. They hiked together for the remaining miles, their conversation ranging from trail gossip to Eugene's plans after he finished his hike. Clarence found himself enjoying the company. Solo hiking had its benefits, but it was nice to have someone to talk to occasionally. They arrived at the shelter around 5 in the evening, with plenty of daylight remaining. But as they approached, both men noticed something that immediately changed the atmosphere. The shelter was already occupied by 3 men who were clearly not through hikers. They wore camouflage hunting gear, had several coolers stacked near the shelter, and their conversation stopped abruptly when Clarence and Eugene came into view. One of them, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a thick beard, stood up and walked to the edge of the shelter platform. "Shelter's full," the man said flatly. His tone was not friendly, and there was no attempt at the usual trail courtesy. The 2 other men remained seated but watched Clarence and Eugene with obvious suspicion. Clarence immediately assessed the situation with the trained eye of someone who had spent years evaluating potential threats. These men were not hikers. They had no backpacks, no trail gear, and their boots were wrong for long-distance hiking. More importantly, their body language was aggressive and territorial. "We're just looking for a place to stay for the night," Eugene said, trying to sound casual. Plenty of room in there for everyone. The bearded man shook his head. I said it's full. You two need to move on. Clarence remained silent, his eyes moving over the scene. Something was very wrong here. It was not hunting season, and even if it were, hunters did not typically use AT shelters as base camps. He noticed that none of the men had hunting licenses displayed, which was required by law. He also noticed a handheld radio clipped to the bearded man's belt, crackling occasionally with static and brief, coded transmissions. Listen, Clarence said, keeping his voice level and non-confrontational. We've hiked a long way today. Next shelter is 8 miles north, and it's getting late. We can set up tents down the trail a bit if the shelter's too crowded. The bearded man, who had introduced himself as Dale, seemed to consider this. Yeah, you do that. Set up somewhere down the trail. Don't need you two hanging around here. Eugene looked at Clarence, clearly wanting to argue. But Clarence gave him a subtle shake of the head. This was not a situation worth escalating. They moved down the trail about 200 yards and found a relatively flat area where they could pitch their tents out of sight of the shelter. Eugene was visibly frustrated as they set up camp. What is their problem? Eugene asked in a low voice. Since when do people just claim a whole shelter like that? They're not hikers, Clarence said quietly, his attention focused on setting up his tent with efficient movements. And I don't think they're hunters either. Something else is going on. As darkness fell, both men prepared their dinners on their camp stoves, speaking in hushed tones. The forest grew quiet except for the usual sounds of insects and the occasional bird call. But around 9 o'clock, they heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching on the nearby Forest Service road. Clarence immediately held up a hand for silence, and both men listened intently. They heard the vehicle stop, heard doors opening and closing, and then heard voices carrying through the trees. The conversation was too far away to make out specific words, but the tone was businesslike and urgent. Clarence made a decision. Stay here, he whispered to Eugene. I'm going to take a look. Are you crazy? Eugene hissed back. Those guys already made it clear they don't want us around. Which is exactly why I need to see what they're doing, Clarence replied. Something illegal is happening at that shelter, and I want to know what we're dealing with. Before Eugene could protest further, Clarence moved into the trees, using the low visibility tactics he had learned decades ago in the military. He moved slowly and carefully, testing each footfall before committing his weight, keeping to the shadows. It took him nearly 15 minutes to cover the 200 yards back to the shelter area. But when he finally had a clear line of sight, what he saw confirmed his suspicions. A white pickup truck was parked on the Forest Service road, and the 3 men from the shelter were transferring packages from the truck bed to the shelter area. The packages were wrapped in plastic and tape, uniform in size, and handled with obvious care. Dale was directing the operation while speaking into his radio, and Clarence caught fragments of the conversation. Words like shipment, route, and next drop carried clearly through the night air. This was not a hunting trip. This was a drug operation, and the shelter was being used as a transfer point. Clarence had seen enough. He began backing away slowly, retracing his path through the woods. But in his focus on watching the men, he failed to notice a dead branch directly behind his foot. When his weight came down, the branch snapped with a crack that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Instantly, all activity at the shelter stopped. Dale's head snapped around, and he shouted, "Someone's out there!" Flashlight beams lanced through the darkness, sweeping the tree line. Clarence abandoned stealth and ran, crashing through the underbrush back toward where Eugene was waiting. Behind him, he could hear the men giving chase, their lights bobbing through the trees. He burst into their camping area to find Eugene already stuffing his sleeping bag into his pack with shaking hands. "Run!" Clarence shouted. "North on the trail now." They grabbed their packs, leaving their tents behind, and ran down the trail in near total darkness. The voices behind them were getting closer, and Clarence could hear at least 2, maybe 3 men crashing through the forest in pursuit. His lungs burned and his legs protested, but fear and adrenaline drove him forward. Eugene was younger and faster, but he stayed close, occasionally looking back with wild eyes. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, their headlamps casting wild shadows on the trail ahead. Clarence's military training kept him focused despite the panic. He knew they needed to get off the obvious path, needed to find somewhere to hide. When they reached a trail intersection with a blue blaze side trail, he grabbed Eugene's arm and pulled him off the main path. "Lights off," Clarence commanded, and they both killed their headlamps, plunging into complete darkness. They stumbled down the side trail until Clarence spotted a tumble of large boulders off to the left. "There," he whispered, and they scrambled behind the rocks, pressing themselves into the smallest space possible. They heard their pursuers reach the intersection less than a minute later. The men were breathing hard, and their flashlights swept back and forth across the trail. Clarence and Eugene held absolutely still, barely breathing, as the lights came terrifyingly close to their hiding spot. One of the men walked to within 20 feet of the boulder pile, his light passing just inches from Eugene's boot. Then Clarence heard the sound that made his blood run cold. One of the men pulled out a cell phone and made a call. In the quiet night, they could hear his side of the conversation clearly. "Yeah, we got 2 witnesses," the man said, his voice hard. "They saw the whole setup. We're tracking them now, but they're moving fast. We're going to need the cleanup crew if we catch them." The casual way the man said "cleanup crew" left no doubt about what he meant. These people were willing to kill to protect their operation. Clarence felt Eugene trembling beside him and put a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder. The men spent nearly 40 minutes searching the area around the intersection, their lights sweeping through the trees, their voices growing more frustrated. Finally, apparently deciding that Clarence and Eugene had continued north on the main trail, they moved on. But Clarence and Eugene remained hidden for another hour, too terrified to move, listening to every sound in the forest. When Clarence finally decided it was safe, they emerged from their hiding spot stiff and cold, rather than continue north on the trail, which is what the men would expect. Clarence made the decision to hike east on the Blue Blaze Trail, which he knew would eventually connect to another Forest Service road. They hiked through the remainder of the night, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that people were hunting them. As dawn broke, they reached a paved road and flagged down the first vehicle they saw, a farmer heading to town in a battered pickup truck. The man took one look at their faces and agreed to drive them to the nearest town without asking questions. From there, they called the authorities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Park police arrived within an hour, followed shortly by DEA agents who seemed very interested in Clarence's description of the shelter location and the men involved. It turned out that the shelter had been under investigation for months as a suspected drug transfer point. But authorities had been unable to catch anyone in the act. Clarence and Eugene's testimony provided the evidence needed to launch a raid. But when officers arrived at the shelter 18 hours later, it was empty. The men had cleared out completely, taking everything with them, They found evidence that the location had been used for illegal activity, tire tracks, disturbed earth, and a few discarded items. But the operation had been abandoned. Dale and his associates were never caught. The case remained open, and authorities warned both Clarence and Eugene that it would be safest to skip the next 50-mile section of trail entirely. Eugene took their advice and got off the trail completely. He called his parents that same day and asked them to come pick him up. His through hike was over. Clarence, however, made a different choice. After a 2-week break to let things cool down, and after receiving assurances from law enforcement that the area was being monitored, he returned to the trail and continued his northbound journey. But Clarence never forgot that night. He never forgot the sound of footsteps in the darkness, the feeling of hiding behind those rocks while men discussed killing him as casually as ordering coffee. He completed his through hike 4 months later, reaching Katahdin in August. But when people asked him about his favorite moments on the trail, he never mentioned Virginia. And when younger hikers asked him for advice, he always told them the same thing. Trust your instincts, and remember that the greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the ones you expect. Harold Brennan had been planning his photography trip to the Great Smoky Mountains for over a year. At 38 years old, he had built a modest career as a nature photographer, selling prints online and occasionally landing assignments with outdoor magazines. The Smokies in mid-October were legendary for their autumn colors, and Harold had carefully researched the best locations for capturing the fall foliage at its peak. The Appalachian Trail section through the park offered some of the most spectacular vistas, and Harold had planned a 5-day trek that would take him through the highlands, where the elevation provided sweeping views of the mountains rolling away in every direction. He started his hike on a Wednesday morning, his pack loaded with camera equipment, extra batteries, and enough food to last him through the weekend. The weather forecast called for clear skies and unseasonably warm temperatures, perfect conditions for photography. Harold made good progress on the first day, stopping frequently to set up shots, experimenting with different angles and lighting. By late afternoon on the second day, he reached Spence Field, a high-elevation grassy bald that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding peaks. The shelter at Spence Field was a simple 3-sided structure, typical of the AT shelters throughout the Smokies. When Harold arrived around 5 in the evening, he found 3 other hikers already settled in for the night, a couple from Ohio and a solo hiker from Virginia. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, shared information about trail conditions, and prepared their dinners together. Harold mentioned that he planned to camp in his tent rather than sleep in the shelter, wanting the flexibility to wake early for sunrise photography without disturbing the others. As they ate, the conversation turned to the peculiar reputation of Spence Field. The solo hiker, a man in his 60s who had been hiking the AT for years, mentioned casually that many hikers avoided staying in this particular area if they could help it. When Harold asked why, the man shrugged and said that the place had a bad reputation, though he was vague about the details. The couple from Ohio exchanged glances, but said nothing. Harold laughed it off, assuming it was just typical trail superstition. Every popular hiking area had its ghost stories and urban legends. By 7 in the evening, the other hikers had retreated into their sleeping bags. Harold set up his tent about 50 yards from the shelter, choosing a spot that would give him an unobstructed view of the eastern horizon for the sunrise. The evening was remarkably warm for October, and he left his tent flaps partially open to let in the breeze. As darkness settled over the mountains, a thick fog began rolling in, moving across the grassy field in slow, undulating waves. Harold watched it for a while, considering whether it would interfere with his morning photography plans, then eventually crawled into his sleeping bag. He was not sure what time it was when he woke, but the darkness was complete. His watch showed 11:17. Something had pulled him from sleep, some sound that his unconscious mind had registered as wrong. He lay still, listening, trying to identify what had disturbed him. Then he heard it again, the sound of children laughing. The laughter was clear and distinct, multiple voices, the carefree sound of kids playing a game. But there were no children on this isolated section of trail, no families camping nearby. Harold unzipped his sleeping bag and moved to the tent entrance, peering out into the fog-shrouded field. The visibility was terrible, perhaps 15 feet at most. The fog had thickened considerably, turning the landscape into a formless gray void. But the laughter came again, closer now, from somewhere out in that fog. Harold called out, his voice sounding strange and muffled in the dense air. "Hello? Is everything okay? Do you need help?" The laughter stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was absolute, more complete than any silence Harold had experienced. No insects, no wind, no distant sounds of the forest. Just an emptiness that felt somehow hostile. He waited, his heart beginning to pound, wondering if he should go back to the shelter and wake the other hikers. Before he could decide, the laughter started again. But this time, it came from multiple directions simultaneously. The voices were circling him, moving through the fog in patterns that made no sense. Harold fumbled for his headlamp and switched it on, the beam cutting weakly through the fog. He swept it back and forth across the field, trying to locate the source of the sounds. For just a moment, he caught sight of something moving at the edge of his light's range, small shadows that darted quickly out of view. They were child-sized, low to the ground, moving with an odd, skittering quality that did not look quite right. He called out again, his voice less steady now. "Who is out there? This is not funny." The response was immediate and chilling. A voice spoke from directly behind his tent, so close that it seemed impossible he had not heard someone approach. The voice was an adult's voice, deep and masculine, but it whispered his name. Harold. Just that, nothing more. His full name, spoken with perfect clarity by someone or something that should not know who he was. Harold spun around, his light sweeping across the area behind his tent. There was nothing there, just grass and fog and the dark line of trees 50 feet away. He scrambled backward, retreating into his tent and zipped it shut with shaking hands. This was not right. None of this was right. He grabbed his hiking poles, the only thing he had that could serve as a weapon, and sat in the center of his tent, listening. The footsteps started a few minutes later. They circled his tent slowly and deliberately, the sound of feet moving through grass, except that the footsteps sounded wrong. There were too many of them, and they did not follow a normal walking rhythm. Harold counted at least 6 or 7 distinct sets of footsteps, all moving around his tent in a slow, synchronized circle. He wanted to scream, wanted to run to the shelter. But some instinct told him that leaving the tent would be a terrible mistake. Then the voices began. They started as whispers, dozens of overlapping whispers in different tones and pitches, speaking words Harold could not quite make out. The whispers gradually grew louder, resolving into recognizable sounds, and Harold realized with mounting horror that the voices were repeating things he had said earlier. Fragments of his conversation with the other hikers, played back in perfect mimicry. His own voice discussing his photography plans, his concerns about the weather, his casual goodbye to the others. But the voices were not quite right. They had a hollow quality, like recordings played through damaged speakers. Harold pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sounds. But they seemed to come from inside his head as much as from outside the tent. The circling footsteps continued, never pausing, never stopping. Hours passed, though Harold had lost all sense of time. His watch showed midnight, then 1 in the morning, then 2. The voices never stopped their horrible mimicry, cycling through everything he had said, sometimes playing phrases backward, sometimes overlapping multiple recordings until they became a chaotic cacophony. At some point after 2 in the morning, the tent zipper began to move. Harold watched in frozen terror as the zipper slowly, deliberately opened from the outside. He had locked it, he was certain of that. But it opened anyway, the tab moving smoothly down as though pulled by invisible fingers. Through the widening gap, Harold could see the fog outside, but there was nothing else visible. No hand, no person, nothing to explain how the zipper was moving. Then he saw the hand. It reached through the opening, pale and elongated, with fingers that had too many joints. The fingers bent at angles that human fingers could not achieve, flexing and stretching as they groped inside the tent, searching. Harold kicked at the hand with all his strength, connecting solidly with what felt like cold, rubbery flesh. The hand withdrew instantly, and the tent zipper snapped shut again. Immediately, the voices outside changed. They stopped their mimicry and began to scream. But it was Harold's scream they were making. His own voice, his own terror, played back at him from a dozen sources at once. The sound was overwhelming, disorienting, and Harold found himself screaming too, adding his real voice to the chorus of false ones until he could not tell which was which. The screaming continued for what felt like hours. Harold huddled in his tent, hiking poles held in white-knuckled fists, convinced that he was losing his mind. But gradually, so slowly that he almost did not notice at first, the sounds began to fade. The screaming voices grew quieter, more distant. The circling footsteps slowed and eventually stopped. By the time Harold's watch showed 4 in the morning, the only sound was his own ragged breathing. He did not dare move, did not dare investigate. He sat in his tent, staring at the zipped entrance, waiting for the attack to resume. But as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, normal sounds returned to the forest. A bird called somewhere in the distance. A breeze rustled the grass. The fog began to thin, revealing the familiar shapes of the landscape around him. When full daylight arrived, Harold finally found the courage to unzip his tent and look outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The grass around his tent was covered in small handprints, dozens of them pressed deep into the earth. But these were not normal handprints. Each one had 6 fingers, and the fingers were far too long, the proportions all wrong. The prints formed a complete circle around his tent, overlapping in places, as though many small hands had pressed themselves into the ground. Harold grabbed his camera with shaking hands and photographed everything. The handprints, the disturbed grass, the entire area around his tent. He did not pack his camping gear, did not stop to make breakfast, did not even go to the shelter to check on the other hikers. He stuffed his camera and essential gear into his pack, abandoned everything else, and started hiking down the trail at a near run. He did not stop until he reached the next road crossing, nearly 8 miles away. From there, he hitched a ride into Gatlinburg and went directly to an outdoor outfitter store he had visited before starting his hike. The owner was a local man in his 70s who had grown up in the shadow of the Smokies. When Harold showed him the photographs on his camera, The man's face went pale. "Where did you take these?" the owner asked quietly. "Spence Field," Harold replied. "Last night." "What are they?" The owner was silent for a long moment, studying the images of the six-fingered handprints. Finally, he looked up at Harold with an expression of deep unease. "You know where you were camping? That whole area before it became a national park, that was Cherokee land, sacred ground. There are stories about that place, old stories that most people think are just legends. The Cherokee talked about the Nunahai, the spirit people. They were supposed to be immortal beings that lived in the high places, and they could take different forms. Sometimes they appeared as children, playing and laughing, trying to lure travelers away from the trails." Harold felt his skin crawl. But the handprints, 6 fingers. "The old stories described them that way," the owner said. "Not quite human, even when they looked human. The Cherokee avoided certain areas in the mountains because of the Nunahai. Spence Field was one of those places. Some say it was a burial ground. Others say it was a doorway between worlds. Either way, it was not a place to spend the night." Harold completed his photography trip, but he avoided the Smokies entirely, choosing instead to photograph the North Carolina sections of the trail. He eventually made it to Maine and got some excellent shots, but he never went back to Spence Field. The photographs he took that morning remained on his memory card, but he never published them, never showed them to anyone except that outfitter in Gatlinburg. Years later, Harold still has nightmares about that night. He dreams of children laughing in the fog, of hands with too many fingers reaching for him, of voices that know his name. And sometimes, in his dreams, he unzips his tent and looks outside to find hundreds of small figures standing in the darkness, all of them staring at him with eyes that reflect his headlamp's light like animals. In those dreams, he always hears the same whispered invitation, spoken in his own voice, calling him to join them in the fog. Agnes and Beatrice Thornton had been hiking together for over 30 years. The sisters, now 62 and 59 respectively, had discovered their love for the outdoors as young women growing up in rural Ohio, and hiking had remained a constant in their lives through marriages, careers, children, and eventually retirement. They were experienced, competent hikers who knew their limits and planned their trips with the kind of careful attention that came from decades of practice. The Pennsylvania section of the Appalachian Trail was familiar territory to them, having hiked portions of it several times over the years. It was early March when they decided to tackle a section they had completed once before, a moderately challenging stretch through Michaud State Forest. The timing was intentional. They wanted to hike before the spring crowds arrived, and they were prepared for the possibility of encountering late-season snow. What they were not prepared for was the sudden storm that rolled in on their second day. A freak weather system that brought heavy snow and plummeting temperatures completely at odds with the forecast they had checked that morning. They had been making good progress when the first flakes began to fall around 2 in the afternoon. Within an hour, the snow was coming down heavily, and visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Agnes, the older and more cautious of the two sisters, suggested they find shelter immediately rather than push on to their planned campsite. Beatrice agreed without argument. The temperature was falling rapidly, and the wind was picking up. This was not a storm to be caught in without protection. Agnes remembered a shelter from their previous hike through this area, an older structure that was not marked on the official trail maps anymore, but had still been standing the last time they passed through. It was only about a quarter-mile off the main trail, if her memory was correct. They found the side trail easily enough, a narrow path nearly obscured by undergrowth, and followed it into the deepening forest. The shelter appeared through the swirling snow exactly where Agnes remembered it. The structure was old, probably built decades ago by the Civilian Conservation Corps, with rough-hewn log walls and a sagging roof that had somehow remained mostly intact. It was not much to look at, but it offered protection from the wind and snow, and that was all that mattered. The sisters pushed through the doorway, grateful to be out of the storm. Inside, they found they were not alone. An elderly woman sat near a small fire in the center of the shelter, tending the flames with a piece of dead wood. She looked up as they entered, and her face broke into a warm smile. She was dressed strangely, wearing what looked like a long woolen dress from another era, dark and heavy, with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was white and pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was deeply lined with age. "Welcome, travelers," the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Come warm yourselves. The mountain is angry today." Agnes and Beatrice exchanged glances, but moved toward the fire gratefully. The woman seemed harmless enough, and her presence actually made the situation feel less isolated. They introduced themselves, and the woman nodded as if she had been expecting them. "I am Mildred," she said simply. "I am the keeper of this place." The phrasing struck Agnes as odd, but she was too cold and tired to dwell on it. They set down their packs and held their hands out to the fire, feeling the warmth gradually return to their frozen fingers. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling through the trees and rattling the shelter's old timbers. Snow blew in through gaps in the walls, and the temperature continued to drop. Agnes realized with growing concern that they might be stuck here for quite some time. Mildred seemed content with the silence for a while, simply staring into the flames. But eventually, she spoke again, her tone conversational, but with an underlying seriousness. "Have you brought an offering for the mountain?" Beatrice looked at her with confusion. "An offering? What do you mean?" "It is tradition," Mildred said, not looking up from the fire. "Travelers who seek shelter in the high places must leave something of value. It is the old way. The mountain provides protection, but it must be honored in return." Agnes forced a polite smile. "I think we will be fine without any offerings. We just need to wait out the storm, and then we will be on our way." Mildred finally looked up, and her eyes were sharp and penetrating despite her age. "You do not understand. The mountain does not give without receiving. If you refuse the tradition, the path will close. You will not leave here." The statement hung in the air, and Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something in the woman's tone, a certainty that went beyond simple superstition. Beatrice laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "Well, we do not really have anything valuable with us, just hiking gear." "Something precious," Mildred insisted. "Something that has meaning to you. That is what the mountain requires." Agnes was about to dismiss the entire conversation as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman when she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Outside the shelter, the storm was growing worse. But it was not just intensifying naturally. The wind seemed to be centered on the shelter itself, as if the building were the focus of the storm's rage. Snow was piling up against the entrance at an alarming rate, and the temperature inside the shelter was dropping despite the fire. Beatrice noticed it too. "Agnes," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "This is not normal." Mildred rose to her feet with surprising ease for someone of her apparent age. Her demeanor had changed completely. The warm smile was gone, replaced by an expression of cold demand. "The mountain takes what it is owed. You came here seeking shelter. Shelter has been granted, but nothing is free in the high places. Give your offering, or the storm will not pass. The path will close. You will join the others who refused. Agnes wanted to argue, wanted to laugh it off as nonsense. But the storm outside was becoming impossible to ignore. The snow had already blocked half the doorway. The wind was so loud it sounded like screaming. And the temperature, despite the fire that should have been warming the small space, continued to fall. Her breath was visible in the air, and her fingers were going numb again. Beatrice was shaking, and Agnes could not tell if it was from cold or fear. "Agnes, what do we do?" "This is insane," Agnes said, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked at Mildred, at the implacable certainty in the old woman's eyes, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. "What kind of offering?" "Something you love," Mildred said. "Something that binds you to your old life. The mountain hungers for such things." Beatrice was already moving, reaching into her pack with trembling hands. She pulled out a small jewelry bag and opened it, removing a simple gold wedding ring. It had been on her finger for 32 years before arthritis had forced her to start wearing it on a chain around her neck instead. It was the most valuable thing she owned, not in monetary terms, but in meaning. She held it for a moment, tears streaming down her face, then walked to the corner of the shelter where a crude altar of stacked stones sat against the wall. Agnes had not noticed the altar before, but now it seemed impossible to miss. The stones were old, covered in moss and strange markings that might have been symbols or might have been nothing more than weathering. Beatrice placed the ring on top of the stones, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The moment the ring touched the stones, everything changed. The wind stopped, not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had closed a door. The howling ceased, and in its place came an eerie silence. The temperature in the shelter immediately began to rise. Outside, through the half-blocked doorway, Agnes could see that the snow had stopped falling. Mildred smiled, the warm expression returning to her face. "The mountain accepts your offering. You will have safe passage." She turned and walked toward the back wall of the shelter, her movements slow and deliberate. Agnes watched in disbelief as the old woman walked directly into the solid log wall and disappeared, not passing through a door or opening, but simply ceasing to exist as she made contact with the wood. Beatrice screamed and stumbled backward. Agnes rushed to the wall, running her hands over the rough logs, searching for any gap or trick. But the wall was completely solid. There was no door, no opening, no way anyone could have passed through. She looked at her sister, and in that moment, they both understood that they had experienced something that should not have been possible. They did not sleep that night. They sat by the fire, which continued to burn without anyone adding wood to it, and waited for dawn. Neither spoke. When the first light of morning finally crept through the doorway, they grabbed their packs and fled the shelter without looking back. The ring was gone from the altar. Agnes checked, hoping desperately that it had just fallen and could be recovered. But there was no sign of it anywhere. The stones were bare, and the strange markings she had seen the night before were no longer visible. The storm had passed completely, and the morning was clear and cold. They hiked directly to the nearest road crossing and called for a ride. While they waited, Beatrice could not stop crying. "That was my wedding ring?" she kept saying. 32 years. How am I going to explain this to Michael? 2 days later, after they had returned home and tried to process what had happened, they decided to report the experience. They drove back to the area with a park ranger. determined to prove that the shelter existed, that something inexplicable had occurred. But when they reached the location where the shelter should have been, they found only a cleared area with old foundation stones. The ranger consulted his maps and records and confirmed that a shelter had indeed stood there once, but it had burned down in 1943. There had been one casualty in the fire, a woman who served as a volunteer shelter keeper. Her name, according to the historical records, was Mildred Chenoweth. The ranger showed them a photograph from the park archives, a black and white image from 1942 showing the shelter in its prime. Standing in front of it was a woman in a long, dark dress with a shawl around her shoulders. The resemblance to the woman they had met was unmistakable. Beatrice never recovered her ring. She told her husband she had lost it on the trail, and he was understanding. But the lie sat between them like a weight. Her marriage, which had been strong for over 3 decades, began to deteriorate. Small arguments became large fights. Trust eroded. Within 6 months, they had separated. And a year after that night in the shelter, the divorce was finalized. Agnes and Beatrice still hiked together occasionally, but they never returned to Pennsylvania. They never speak about what happened in that shelter, about Mildred, about the offering. But both sisters know that some bargains, once made, cannot be undone. The mountain took what it was owed, and the price was far higher than a simple ring. Stanley Morrison prided himself on being meticulous. At 29 years old, the IT professional from Seattle had quit his job specifically to attempt a southbound through hike of the Appalachian Trail, a decision that baffled his coworkers but made perfect sense to him. Stanley liked control, liked knowing exactly where he was and what was happening at all times. It was this personality trait that made him an excellent systems analyst and an obsessive trail journaler. Every evening, without fail, Stanley would sit in his tent or at a shelter and record every detail of his day in a leather-bound journal. Miles hiked, elevation gained and lost, weather conditions, people encountered, food consumed, water sources used, and detailed notes about his physical and mental state. He logged everything with the precision of someone documenting a scientific experiment. His friends joked that his journal entries were detailed enough that someone could retrace his exact steps years later and recreate his entire experience. By early September, Stanley had made it to Vermont, and his journal showed that he was on track to finish his through hike by late October. He was in excellent physical condition, his gear was dialed in, and he was averaging around 20 miles per day, with consistent ease. The Vermont section was beautiful, with the leaves just beginning to turn and the weather still warm enough for comfortable camping. Stanley was feeling confident and strong. On the evening of September 7th, he camped alone at a small clearing about 2 miles south of Glastonbury Mountain, an area known for its rugged terrain and limited water sources. His journal entry that night was characteristically detailed. He recorded that he had hiked 18.3 miles, consumed 2,400 calories, filtered 3 liters of water from a small stream, and planned to wake at 6 in the morning to complete another 18-mile day that would take him past Glastonbury and on toward Stratton Mountain. His entry concluded with a note that he felt slightly more tired than usual, but attributed it to the challenging terrain. He set his alarm, checked his GPS to confirm his location, and went to sleep. When Stanley woke, his alarm was beeping insistently, and sunlight was streaming through his tent. He checked his watch and saw that it showed 6:03 in the morning, exactly as planned. He went through his usual morning routine with practiced efficiency, breaking down his tent, eating breakfast, and starting down the trail by 7 o'clock. He remembered making the decision to take the main trail rather than a bypass route. Remembered checking his map, remembered adjusting his pack straps for comfort. The next thing Stanley clearly remembered was sitting on the trail in near darkness, confused and disoriented. He looked at his watch and saw that it read 7:45, but the sun was setting rather than rising. He was no longer where he remembered being. In fact, he had no idea where he was. With shaking hands, he pulled out his GPS device and waited for it to acquire a signal. When the coordinates appeared, Stanley felt his confusion deepen into something approaching panic. According to the GPS, he was 31 miles north of where he had started that morning. He had somehow covered not the planned 18 miles, but over 30 miles, and he had absolutely no memory of hiking them. He looked at his phone, hoping to find some explanation, and saw that it was indeed 7:45 in the evening. 12 hours and 45 minutes had passed since he started hiking, and he could remember perhaps the first 30 minutes. Stanley opened his journal with trembling fingers, hoping that he had made notes during the day that might explain the gap. What he found made his blood run cold. There was an entry dated that day, written in his own handwriting, but he had absolutely no memory of writing it. The entry was brief and cryptic. "They showed me the pattern. I understand now. The trees know the way. The numbers spiral. 8 becomes infinity. I have been here before. I will be here again." The words made no sense. Stanley never wrote like that. His entries were factual, precise, devoid of any mysticism or vague philosophizing. He stared at the page, trying to recognize his own thoughts in those sentences. But it was as if someone else had possessed his hand and written in his style. He checked the rest of his gear, looking for more clues. His water bottles were empty, though he distinctly remembered filling them at breakfast. His food bag was lighter, indicating he had eaten lunch and snacks, but he had no memory of stopping to eat. Then he noticed his boots. They were caked with red clay, thick and dried, covering the soles and creeping up the sides. Stanley knew the soil in Vermont was not red. He had been hiking through this region for over a week, and the ground was consistently dark brown or gray. Red clay was not something he had encountered anywhere on the trail in this state. He tried to scrape some of it off, and it came away in hard chunks, as if it had been walked through while wet and then baked dry. Stanley pulled out his smartphone, hoping the photo app might provide answers. What he found was both illuminating and deeply disturbing. The phone showed 68 photographs taken between 2:15 and 6:20 in the afternoon, during the hours he could not remember. He began scrolling through them with mounting dread. The photos showed him at various locations along the trail. He recognized some of the landmarks from his maps, confirming that he had indeed hiked over 30 miles. But the photos were wrong in ways he could not fully articulate. In some, he appeared to be off trail entirely, standing in dense forest where no path was visible. In others, he was photographing specific trees, taking close-up shots of their bark. When he zoomed in on these images, he saw that the bark had been carved with geometric symbols, intricate patterns of lines, and circles that formed configurations he did not recognize but found strangely compelling. Several photos appeared to be selfies, taken by holding the phone at arm's length. In these images, Stanley was smiling widely, his eyes strangely vacant, his expression completely at odds with his normal demeanor. He never took selfies. He found them pointless and narcissistic. Yet here were dozens of images of himself grinning at the camera with an expression that looked more like a mask than genuine emotion. The final photograph was the most disturbing. It showed a view looking straight up through the forest canopy, the phone aimed at the sky. Between the branches, barely visible but unmistakably present, were dark shapes. They were too large to be birds, too irregular in form to be aircraft. They hung in the air like enormous shadows, and though the image was slightly blurred, Stanley could see what looked like appendages extending from the shapes, thin and numerous, reaching down toward the forest floor. Stanley checked his GPS tracker, the device that had been passively logging his movements all day. He pulled up the data and stared at the route he had supposedly walked. It made no sense. The track showed him moving in an impossible zigzag pattern, covering more than 40 miles in 6 hours while simultaneously doubling back over his own route multiple times. The elevation data showed him climbing and descending thousands of feet in ways that did not match the terrain. It was as if he had been moving at superhuman speed, or as if space itself had been folding around him as he walked. Stanley spent the night at the next shelter, arriving well after dark and disturbing several sleeping hikers with his arrival. He did not sleep. He sat with his back against the shelter wall, his headlamp on, reviewing the photos and GPS data over and over, trying to find a rational explanation. By morning, he had come to only one conclusion. Something had happened to him during those lost hours, something he could not explain and could not remember. And whatever it was had changed him in ways he did not yet understand. At the next town, he went to the local urgent care clinic and requested a full medical workup. The doctor was skeptical but thorough, running blood tests, checking for signs of head trauma, asking questions about drug use that Stanley answered honestly. Everything came back normal. No drugs in his system, no medical conditions that might explain memory loss, no signs of physical injury. The doctor suggested he might have experienced a dissociative episode brought on by the stress and isolation of solo hiking and recommended he take a few days off the trail to rest. But Stanley knew it was not stress. He felt fine physically. His mind was clear now, even if it had not been during those lost hours. Something had happened on that trail. Something that existed outside the boundaries of normal experience. He contacted the Park Service and filed a detailed report, including copies of his GPS data and selected photographs. A researcher reached out to him 2 days later, a woman from a private organization that investigated unusual occurrences in wilderness areas. The researcher told him that he was not alone. Since 2019, 8 other hikers had reported similar experiences in that specific section of Vermont Trail. All described lost time, ranging from 2 hours to an entire day. All had GPS data showing impossible travel patterns. All had photographs they did not remember taking, many featuring the same carved symbols on trees. And all reported finding red clay on their boots despite the local soil being completely different in composition. Stanley completed his through hike, reaching Springer Mountain in Georgia 2 months later. But the experience had changed him fundamentally. His journal entries after that day were less detailed, less confident. He stopped tracking every mile and calorie with obsessive precision. He had learned that control was an illusion, that there were things in the world that could not be measured or logged or understood through data. He still has the photographs on his phone. He still has the journal entry he does not remember writing. And he still has recurring dreams, vivid and unsettling, in which he walks through forests that shift and spiral around him, while voices whisper about patterns he is beginning to comprehend. In those dreams, he sees the symbols from the tree bark, and he understands them perfectly. But when he wakes, the meaning slips away, leaving only a profound sense that something in those Vermont woods had touched his mind and left a mark that would never fade. Norman Chen and Ralph Donnelly had been friends since their freshman year at Penn State. where they had bonded over a shared love of hiking and a mutual inability to sit still through boring lectures. That was 23 years ago. Now both men were in their mid-40s, settled into careers and family life. But they made a point of taking at least one hiking trip together each year. It was their way of maintaining a friendship that might otherwise have faded into occasional social media comments and annual holiday cards. This year they had chosen a week-long section hike through the Roan Highlands, a spectacularly beautiful stretch of the Appalachian Trail that straddles the North Carolina and Tennessee border. Mid-July was perhaps not the ideal time for hiking in the South, with temperatures pushing into the 90s and humidity making every climb feel twice as difficult. But their work schedules had not allowed for any other timing. They had started their hike on a Monday morning and were now on their third day, making steady progress despite the heat. They arrived at the shelter around 6 in the evening, both men exhausted and drenched in sweat. The shelter was already crowded, a 3-sided structure with 2 sleeping platforms that were nearly full. Norman counted 8 other hikers, a mix of through hikers and section hikers like themselves. There was one remaining space on the upper platform, just barely large enough for both of them if they squeezed together. They claimed the spot gratefully, glad to have a roof over their heads for the night. As they unpacked their gear and began preparing dinner, Norman noticed one hiker who stood out from the others. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, sat alone in the far corner of the upper platform. He faced the wall rather than the communal space, and his gear was unlike anything Norman had seen on the trail. The backpack looked like it was from the 1970s, an old external frame pack in faded green canvas. The sleeping bag was the same era, a bulky rectangular bag that probably weighed 10 pounds. Even the man's clothes seemed vintage, worn blue jeans and a flannel shirt instead of modern hiking apparel. "Check out that guy's gear," Ralph whispered, nodding toward the old man. "That stuff belongs in a museum." Norman agreed, but said nothing. The trail attracted all types, and who was he to judge someone's equipment choices? But there was something about the man that made him uncomfortable, something beyond just the outdated gear. The man had not acknowledged their arrival, had not made eye contact or offered any greeting. He just sat there facing the wall, perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. As darkness fell and the other hikers settled into their sleeping bags, the shelter grew quiet. Norman was just drifting off to sleep when he heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner where the old man sat. Norman opened his eyes and listened. The man was speaking, a continuous stream of words too quiet to make out. Norman assumed he was praying or perhaps talking to himself, something that was not uncommon among solo hikers who spent too much time alone. He closed his eyes again and tried to ignore it. But the whispering continued, hour after hour. Norman could not sleep through it, and from the way Ralph kept shifting position, neither could his friend. The words were rhythmic, repetitive, like a chant or litany. Norman caught occasional words that sounded like names. Sarah, Michael, Jennifer, David. The names went on, different names, always whispered in the same flat, emotionless tone. Around 2 in the morning, Norman had had enough. He sat up and looked toward the corner, intending to politely ask the man to keep it down. What he saw made him freeze. The old man was sitting upright, no longer facing the wall. Instead, he was staring directly at Norman, his eyes clearly visible even in the darkness. The whispered name stopped immediately, and the silence that followed felt oppressive. "You should not have brought him here," the old man said, his voice no longer a whisper but clear and distinct. Everyone in the shelter was awake now, and Norman could feel Ralph tense beside him, "Excuse me?" Norman said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "I do not understand what you mean." The old man's gaze shifted to Ralph, and he raised one skeletal finger to point directly at him. "He knows what he did. The mountain knows. They all know." Ralph sat up abruptly, his face pale even in the dim light. "What are you talking about? I do not know you." 15 years ago, the old man said, his voice taking on a strange quality, hollow and echoing. "August 23rd, Route 17. The passenger died. You walked away. You let them believe it was not your fault. The shelter had gone completely silent. Every hiker was awake and listening now. Norman turned to look at his friend and saw an expression on Ralph's face that confirmed what the old man was saying. It was an expression of pure terror and guilt, the look of someone whose deepest secret had just been exposed. "Ralph?" Norman said quietly. "What is he talking about?" Ralph was shaking, his breath coming in short gasps. "I do not know how he knows that. I never told anyone. Nobody knows." The old man stood, moving with an ease that seemed at odds with his apparent age. He began walking toward Ralph, his steps slow and deliberate. "You brought yourself here. This is your reckoning place. The mountain calls those who carry guilt. The mountain demands truth." Norman watched in horror as the old man continued his approach, and he could see now that there was something fundamentally wrong about him. His movements were too smooth, too fluid. His eyes did not blink, and as he drew closer, Norman realized he could not hear the man breathing. "There was an accident," Ralph said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I was driving home from a party. My friend Jake was with me. I had been drinking, not a lot, but enough that I should not have been driving. I missed a curve and hit a tree. Jake died, but when the cops came, I told them he had been driving. I switched seats while I was waiting for help. Everyone believed me. His family buried him thinking he was responsible for his own death." The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Several of the other hikers had pulled out their phones, and Norman could see in the glow of their screens that they were recording this. Someone suggested calling the authorities. Someone else said they should all leave the shelter immediately. The old man stopped directly in front of Ralph, close enough to touch him. "You brought yourself here. This is your reckoning place." Ralph broke. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, grabbed his headlamp, and ran from the shelter into the darkness. Norman called after him, but Ralph did not stop. Norman and 2 other hikers grabbed their own lights and followed, leaving their packs behind. They found Ralph about 100 yards down the trail, sitting on the ground with his back against a tree, sobbing. Norman approached slowly, uncertain what to say. His friend of over 20 years had just confessed to a crime, had just admitted to lying about a death, had destroyed someone's memory to save himself. Norman did not know how to process it. "I need to go back," Ralph said between gasps. "I need to turn myself in. I cannot live with this anymore." The other hikers agreed to stay with Ralph while Norman returned to the shelter to get their gear. As he approached the structure, he noticed something strange. The shelter was completely silent. He climbed back up to the platform and looked toward the corner where the old man had been sitting. The space was empty. The vintage backpack was gone. The sleeping bag was gone. It was as if the man had never been there at all. Norman asked the other hikers where the old man had gone, but they all looked at him with confusion. One woman, a through hiker from Colorado, said she had not seen anyone leave the shelter. Norman insisted that the old man had been there, had spoken to Ralph, but as he looked around at the faces of the other hikers, He saw only uncertainty. What was his name? One of them asked. Did he sign the register? Norman grabbed the shelter register, a notebook kept in a plastic bag near the entrance. He flipped through the pages, looking for any entry from the old man. There was nothing. Every hiker currently in the shelter had signed in, but there was no entry for anyone matching the description of the man who had confronted Ralph. They searched the area around the shelter with flashlights, looking for any sign that the old man had been there, any footprints or dropped gear or evidence of his presence. They found nothing. Norman checked his pack, wondering if he had been so tired that he had hallucinated the entire encounter. But Ralph's confession was real. The other hikers had heard it. Some had recorded it. Ralph left the trail the next morning. Norman helped him hike out to the nearest road crossing, where Ralph's wife came to pick him up. Within a week, Ralph had contacted an attorney and turned himself in to the authorities. The case made local news. A 15-year-old hit-and-run death finally solved through an unexpected confession on the Appalachian Trail. Norman completed the section hike alone, but he could not stop thinking about the old man in the shelter. At the next town, he stopped at an outfitter and asked if anyone knew about hikers who used vintage gear. The owner listened to his description and went pale. He pulled out a worn newspaper clipping from 1978. It showed a photograph of a man who looked exactly like the person Norman had seen. The man's name was Albert Grayson, and he had been murdered in that same shelter 47 years ago by his hiking partner during an argument. The killer was never caught. Gertrude Walsh and Doris Campbell had been best friends for over 50 years, having met as young teachers at the same elementary school in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now both retired, at 68 and 71 respectively. They had more time than ever to pursue their shared passion for hiking. They were careful hikers, always aware of their limitations, always prepared with proper gear and conservative itineraries. Their families trusted them completely, knowing that the two women had enough collective wisdom and experience to handle any situation the trail might present. Late May had seemed like the perfect time for a 3-day section hike through the North Carolina portion of the Appalachian Trail. The weather was warm but not oppressively hot, and the crowds of summer had not yet arrived. They had planned their route carefully, with modest daily mileages and well-established campsites. On their second evening, they aimed to reach Mack's Patch, a spectacular grassy bald mountain summit that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding peaks. It was one of the most photographed locations on the entire trail, and both women had been looking forward to camping there and watching the sunset. They arrived at the summit around 7 in the evening, making good time and feeling strong despite the steep climb. The summit was exactly as beautiful as the guidebooks had promised. A vast open meadow sitting atop the mountain, with views that stretched for miles in every direction. The sky was clear, and the evening light was turning everything golden. It should have been perfect. But as they crested the final rise and looked around, both women felt an immediate sense of wrongness. The summit was completely empty. On a perfect Friday evening in late May, one of the most popular camping spots on the trail was utterly deserted. No tents, no other hikers, no one taking photographs or enjoying the sunset. Gertrude and Doris exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected to share the space with at least a dozen other campers, possibly more. The isolation felt unnatural. Maybe everyone is still on their way up, Doris suggested, though she sounded uncertain. Or maybe they went to the shelters instead. Gertrude nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in her stomach. They chose a flat spot near the center of the summit and began setting up their tents. The process was familiar and comforting, and by the time they had camp established and were preparing their dinner, the unease had faded somewhat. The sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. Both women took dozens of photographs, trying to capture the beauty of the moment. As the sun disappeared and darkness settled over the mountain, Doris commented on the unusual color of the sky. Even after the sun was gone, the purple hue remained, deeper and more saturated than any twilight sky she had ever seen. Gertrude agreed that it was strange, but attributed it to atmospheric conditions she did not understand. They finished their dinner and began preparing for sleep. It was Doris who first noticed the stars. She had stepped outside her tent to hang her food bag from the bear cables and found herself staring up at the night sky in confusion. "Gertrude," she called out, her voice tight. "Come look at this." Gertrude emerged from her tent and followed Doris's gaze upward. The stars were wrong. Not just slightly off, but completely incorrect. The constellations were not where they should have been. The Big Dipper was too low on the horizon. Orion was visible, which made no sense in late May. The North Star was in the wrong position. It was as if the entire night sky had been rearranged by someone who only vaguely understood how it was supposed to look. "We are just disremembering," Gertrude said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It has been a long day. We are tired." But the wrongness of the sky was undeniable, and both women felt the unease returning, stronger now. The temperature was dropping faster than it should have, and Gertrude could see her breath in the air, which seemed impossible given that it had been nearly 70 degrees at sunset. They decided to get into their tents and try to sleep, hoping that morning would bring clarity and normalcy. Around 9 o'clock, they heard the sound of footsteps on the trail. Multiple people were approaching the summit, and Gertrude felt a wave of relief. Other hikers meant witnesses, company, normalcy. She called out a greeting, her voice friendly and welcoming. The footsteps grew closer, and headlamps became visible bobbing up the trail. A group of 7 hikers emerged onto the summit, their lights cutting through the darkness. But when Gertrude called out again, offering a hello and asking where they had hiked from, the group did not respond. They walked past her tent without acknowledgement, without even glancing in her direction, as if she were completely invisible to them. Gertrude looked at Doris, who had also emerged from her tent, and saw her own confusion reflected on her friend's face. The group of hikers moved to a spot about 50 feet away and began setting up camp. But something was deeply wrong with what they were watching. The hikers moved in complete silence. There was no sound of tent fabric rustling, no clink of tent stakes being hammered, no conversation, no sound of gear being unpacked. It was like watching a silent film, all visual motion with absolutely no accompanying audio. "This is not right," Doris whispered, moving closer to Gertrude. "What is happening?" Gertrude watched the silent group, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Then she noticed something that made her heart skip. One of the hikers was wearing a distinctive jacket, bright red with a large patch on the back. She recognized that jacket. She had seen it before in a photograph at the visitor center, a memorial photograph of a hiker who had died on the trail. The memory came back clearly. The woman had died 3 years ago in a lightning strike, somewhere on this very mountain. "Doris," Gertrude said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think those people are not alive." The words sounded absurd, even as she spoke them, but Doris did not laugh or argue. She was staring at the group with wide eyes, and Gertrude could see that she had come to the same impossible conclusion. They were watching ghosts, spirits, some kind of replay of events that had already happened. As if responding to their realization, the 7 silent hikers suddenly stopped their setup activities. In perfect unison, all 7 turned to face Gertrude and Doris. 7 pairs of eyes, some reflecting the moonlight in ways that human eyes should not, stared directly at them. Then, moving as one, the hikers raised their arms and pointed down the northern trail, the path that led off the summit toward the next valley. The gesture was urgent, insistent, a clear warning. Gertrude did not hesitate. "We need to leave, right now." They abandoned their tents and gear, grabbing only their headlamps and essential items. Neither woman looked back at the ghost hikers as they started down the northern trail, moving as quickly as they dared in the darkness. The path was steep and rocky, treacherous in the dark, but fear drove them forward. They hiked for over 3 hours, covering ground they would normally take twice as long to traverse, until they finally reached the next shelter around 11 o'clock at night. The shelter was occupied by 3 living, breathing hikers who were startled by their sudden arrival, but confirmed that yes, they could see and hear them, that they were real and present. Gertrude and Doris collapsed on the shelter platform, exhausted and shaking. They said nothing about what they had seen, claiming only that they had left Max Patch due to concerning weather. The next morning, they returned to Max Patch with a park ranger to retrieve their abandoned tents. The ranger was annoyed at what he considered an overreaction, but he agreed to escort them. When they reached the summit, they found their tents exactly as they had left them, untouched and undisturbed. There was no sign of any other camp, no footprints in the grass, no indication that 7 people had been there the night before. As they were packing up their gear, the ranger received a radio call. His expression changed as he listened, and when he signed off, he turned to look at the 2 women with new respect. A severe storm system had moved through the area overnight, bringing dangerous lightning strikes. The storm had hit Max Patch Summit directly around 3 in the morning, and the ranger explained that anyone camping on the exposed summit would have been in extreme danger, possibly fatal danger. "You 2 made the right call leaving when you did," he said. That storm came out of nowhere. Weather Service did not even predict it until after midnight. Gertrude and Doris said nothing, but they understood. The ghost hikers had warned them, had pointed them off the mountain, had saved their lives. Later, they did research and confirmed what Gertrude had suspected. 7 hikers had died on Max Patch in a lightning strike in 2021, caught on the exposed summit during a sudden storm. A memorial had been erected at the base of the mountain, with photographs of all 7 victims. They completed their section hike, but the experience had changed something fundamental in both women. They returned to Max Patch the following spring, carrying flowers that they left at the memorial. It became an annual pilgrimage, their way of honoring the 7 spirits who had reached across the boundary between life and death, to save 2 elderly teachers from sharing their fate. And every time they visit, they'd look up at the summit and wonder if the ghost hikers are still up there, still trying to warn others away from danger, still unable to leave the place where their lives ended.